God's signs and wonders. People have a built-in fascination for the supernatural. I know that I do. We are fascinated with signs and wonders of God, the miracles of God, and we should be. God created the laws of nature, and we live by them every day. Physics, for example, what goes up must come down, right? But there are times when God sovereignly chooses to suspend those laws and do something unexpectedly, supernaturally loving and gracious. These are mysteries to us, and they leave us in awe and wonder, with little doubt that the things that occurred transcended the natural order. In this sermon series, God's Sign and Wonders, we will wrestle with some of the mysteries of God's miraculous signs and wonders. We will look into the relationship between miracles and Christianity, why Christians believe in miracles, and even what miracles you need to believe in to be a Christian. Prayerfully together, we will gain insights into God's amazing and mysterious love for each and every one of us. And this series will leave us curious as to how we can get a miracle ourselves. Today, we will hear about the Miller family's experience with God's miraculous love. We're going to be doing a video first of Teresa Miller's testimony, and after her video plays, Teresa will come up and share more about these miraculous events.
I want to share what happened on August 26th of 2022, which is a date that is ingrained in my memory so strongly. On that day, we were at a back-to-school party, and it was a back-to-school party for my then 8-year-old who was going into 3rd grade. It was great. They had a zip line and a pool and a hot tub and a trampoline and all this great stuff for the kids to play on. And throughout the day, Evie was an amazing swimmer, is an amazing swimmer, and had already been on swim team for a couple years. I really was not worried about her around the water. And so my big focus was on Fiona, who at age 4 was also good in the water. But obviously I needed to be more focused on her. So throughout the day I had kind of been following Fiona around a lot more. And as we got a few hours into the party, I was standing and talking to another mom, who is also a good friend. And we were probably 10, 15 feet from the hot tub, and our girls have been jumping in and out of the hot tub playing. And her daughter comes up to us and said, "Evie's in trouble, I need some help." And she said it real calmly, so we weren't sure what that meant. And so we started walking toward the hot tub, and as we got closer to the hot tub, I realized that I didn't know where Evie was, and that there might be something really, truly wrong. And as I approached the surface of the hot tub, had tons of bubbles, and the blower was on. And so I couldn't see what was happening underneath the water, and as I approached, I could just barely make out a little bit of blue in a swimsuit under the water, and I realized it was Evie. And so I jumped into the hot tub, not knowing what else to do, and I tried to grab a hold of her and pull, and nothing happened. And I tried to pull harder, and again, nothing happened. And so I tried to reach down to try to figure out what was going on, and of course, I was in a panic. And when they say that everything goes tunnel vision in an emergency, I don't know a better way to describe it. Everything focused in at that moment on what was happening in that tub. And I followed my hands down, just trying to figure out what was stopping her from coming up. And her hair had been trapped in something, I didn't know what. And so with 2 hands, I was grabbing her hair and trying to pull with all of my might, and I could not budge her. And I remember thinking, okay, if all of her hair won't move, maybe I can do it in sections. I started yelling for scissors or for anything that could help free me. And thankfully, the dad, the owner of the house, came, and he realized that there was an emergency, and he jumped in with me. And I don't know how, but somehow between the 2 of us, we grabbed her hair and yanked hard enough and freed her. And as she came to the top of the water and I lifted her up, she was completely limp and completely gray, just an unnatural coloring. And I knew at that point in time that we were in serious trouble. I mean, I knew it before then, but I really knew it then. And I stood up in the hot tub with her in my arms, and a dad was standing outside of the hot tub, and so I passed her off. And by the time I got out of the hot tub, they had already started CPR, and I was so thankful that I didn't have to perform CPR on my own child. And so I just knelt down in the grass right next to her, and I grabbed her hand, and my forehead hit the ground. And I prayed so hard that God would save my child. And the mom that I had been talking to, she was on my right, and she came alongside me, and she hugged me, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and I could feel her presence there. And I just prayed and prayed and prayed. And suddenly I felt a hand on my other shoulder, and I thought it was another parent. I didn't think anything of it. And I kept praying, and in the back of my mind, I had this thought like, this isn't it. She's going to be fine. I know she's going to be fine. But at the same time, my logical brain was saying this isn't good. I have a medical background, and so I knew what it meant to be gray. I knew what it meant to be limp, to be underwater for that amount of time. And I knew that the risks were very, very high. So I felt the two people on either side of me, and I just prayed, and I saw them rechecking pulse, and I knew that meant that one round of CPR was done. And I saw them restart another round, and I kept praying, and then I heard her start coughing, and I heard her start screaming, and I felt the hand on my left-hand side lift up. When she started screaming, I started thinking, okay, she's going to be okay. She's going to be all right.
Good morning, church. So there is so much more to the story, but I wanted to take just a minute and pause here for two things. First of all, can we just take a second to praise God for the miraculous outcome that she came back? Bear with me a little bit today. And secondly, I really want to focus in on the presence of God at that moment. I mentioned in the video that I had this thought that she was going to be okay, but it was so much more than that. Put yourself in my position. I'm kneeling on the ground. All 5 of my senses are screaming at me that my child is already gone. I'm holding her hand, I'm kneeling, I've got my head pressed to the ground in the most desperate prayer that I can even describe. And I've got Cindy on my right and this hand on my left, and all of my senses are saying, this is it, she's gone, life is never going to be the same. But at the same time, it was so much more than a feeling. It was a complete and utter confidence. She's not gone, she's right there. And she's going to be fine. And this complete confidence, this complete faith was so powerful that I can't even put it into words. At that moment, it's like I had this direct connection into the supernatural. I could see God, but not with my eyes. I could hear him, but not with my ears. It was feelings that manifested themselves in the same way that we take information in on a day-to-day basis. And that feeling was so powerful. And there was a lightness to it. Almost like when a magician's getting ready to pull a rabbit out of a hat. It's like I could see and feel God turn to me and say, check out this cool trick. And he walked over to Evie and he put his hand on her shoulder, and at that exact moment, she took her first gasp of air. It was at that same moment that I felt that hand on my shoulder lift on the left. So over the next several days and weeks, I had asked around because I was so tunnel visioned. I knew there were people in specific places, but I could not pick a face out of a crowd because I was so focused in. So I had asked around and I had said, who was on my left? I want to be able to thank them for giving me that physical support when I really, really needed it. And I was repetitively told that there was never anybody on my left-hand side. That had to be an angel, and when I had that direct connection to the supernatural, I was able to sense and feel that physical presence holding me up when I needed it the most. Sorry. So, that feeling would change any skeptic's heart in a second. I have complete confidence. But what was really cool about this is I don't think God just gave me the blessing of that feeling. I think he also showed his presence through the hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny miracles that he lined up that day to save the life of Evie. If you knew an event like this was coming, and you had to interview and hire somebody to save the life of your child, what criteria would you look for? For me, it would be somebody who has years of experience, that's been tried and tested and can stay calm under pressure. Maybe somebody with pediatric experience, because kids are different than adults in emergency and medical situations. And, just to add in an extra layer, let's make it somebody who's had experience on Flight for Life, because that's the epitome of emergency situation, right? God interviewed, hired, and placed that person right at the scene for my daughter that day. Here in a minute, you're going to hear the testimony of Joe Lafferty, who did CPR on Evie that day. And earlier in his video testimony, he laid out the scene for why he was even there that day. And I want to share that with you. Joe and his wife and their 3 really incredible kids had just moved back to the area from Ohio. They had not been here very long. So Joe's settling into his job, and they're settling into a new house and unpacking and getting ready. And the 3 kids are getting ready to start school in 3 days. You can imagine the to-do lists and the stuff and the projects that has to be done, right? So on this particular summer day, taking their middle child to a back-to-school party for the whole afternoon with people that they don't really know is just one more thing on that mile-long to-do list, and it's not a high-priority item. It's not something that they really felt they could fit in. So they had already said, "I'm sorry, Harper, we just can't make it work." We've gotten to know the Laffertys really well since this event, which is just one of the blessings that's come out of it. But we've gotten to know Harper really well. She is one of the most easygoing, level, go-with-the-flow kind of personality kids. And on this particular day, she would not let it go. She was adamant, "I want to go to that party and you need to take me." So different than her normal personality. God made it so important for Harper to be at that party that it created a situation that Joe ended up right where he needed to be at the moment he needed to be there to save a life. So I can't say it any better. Let's go ahead and hear from Joe specifically about what a miracle we experienced that day.
And while my background's in emergency response, even though I had been trained in emergency response and had done that for over 10 years as a firefighter paramedic and 5 years as a critical care flight paramedic, it was still a bit of an intense scene. I'd spent several years as a cadet, more than 15 years in emergency response, been on hundreds of cardiac arrests, and cardiac arrest survival is rare. So typically on an average year, people that go into cardiac arrest outside of the hospital setting is about 400,000 times a year, and 16,000 of those are pediatrics, meaning typically less than 16 years old. And survival for an adult is about 1.5%, and survival for a pediatric is about 3%. That survival is just the person having a pulse and breathing. It does not mean that they're neurologically intact and make a full recovery. For someone to do that, even in a pediatric setting, it's less than 3%. So again, to put that in perspective, about every 3 out of 100,000 kids would experience a cardiac arrest outside of the hospital setting, and less than 3% get discharged from the hospital neurologically intact. And I would say out of the hundreds of cardiac arrests that I have attended and worked, even the people that we do get return of spontaneous circulation or their pulse back, maybe 5 or less out of the 15 years ever make an effort to breathe and talk while in the ambulance before arriving at the hospital. Typically that is at the hospital and after long-term care. So this case in particular really stood out to me. A couple other key things that stood out that just made this different from hundreds of times that I had done this is when the ambulance arrived, they had 2 people. And because we were at a rural setting, I knew it would take a while for the ambulance to get there. When the ambulance arrived, they had 2 people. The first person was an untrained person and was a driver, and the second person was a paramedic that had just graduated paramedic school 2 weeks prior to the event. I could tell he was extremely nervous and didn't know exactly what to do, so I explained my background and explained that I could transport with him, and he said, yes, absolutely, could you please come? I feel that I was put here for a reason, and I was used as a vessel from God, because my whole 15 years, and specifically 2 years, I had really studied, and I had a background and specialty in pediatric resuscitation. I had done conferences across the country and throughout the state of Ohio, teaching everyone from paramedics, the paramedic program, respiratory therapists, and even cardiologists and physicians at Nationwide Children's, which is a top leading hospital in the nation for pediatric resuscitation, on some tips, tricks, and skills that you can do to increase the survival for pediatrics. I specialized in that on the flight as well for my 5 years, and this is pediatric resuscitation and childbirth are two things that I would think scares paramedics, and I thought if I became an expert at that, and that was the highest risk thing that could ever happen to me, if I knew that really well, then everything else would be easy. And so while many people shied away, I really focused on childbirth and pediatric resuscitation. And I had zero drugs, I had zero advanced skills. We had prayer and hands and people praying around us. And, the miracle for Evie to regain her pulse, breathing, and even talk and be neurologically intact, especially in the field, occurred. But I know some people in the back of their head might be able to think, hey, was this real? Could she have been pulseless, or did she have a pulse that you couldn't feel? I specialized in pediatric resuscitation. Again, I'd done hundreds of resuscitations, whether in the hospital, out of the hospital, adult or pediatric, and really specialized in everything with pediatrics. And 100% based on all of that experience, Evie was completely pulseless. We had actually felt carotid, brachial, and femoral. Typically, you would not do that in a pediatric, but we had done this on this call. She was completely cyanotic, and the saying goes, if your face and chest are blue, your brain is too, and she was grayish blue. And I say all of that not to paint a stark picture, but to say with 100% certainty that she did not have a pulse and she was not breathing, and it was through God's will that He made this happen and made the outcome so great. So there are several key things that happened on this day that are not a coincidence. One, Harper was very passionate about going, which got me there. Two, while I didn't have my advanced skills, I knew the basics and what to do and what was important to increase the chance of survival. We had key folks around us praying, calling 911, keeping everyone calm. And then the early recognition and early CPR. So those two things are, despite anything else, can have the best chance of survival. And Harper and Reagan recognizing that there's a problem, Harper and Reagan trying to get Evie's hair unstuck, and when that did not happen, Reagan coming out of the hot tub, getting the adults alerted so that the whole process could start, and even the owner of the house quickly, not waiting on scissors and just diving in. Once we arrived in the ambulance, I offered to do the transport again. The paramedic was very nervous, and so I had kind of directed suction and getting the first drug that you'd push, epinephrine, ready. I remember him saying, like, hey, she's conscious now, do we need that? And I said, well, in these situations, people can regress, so you always have to be prepared. And typically it would be, you would have to look up in a book and do 4 calculations for a drug, but because of my background, I knew it off the top of my head, so I was able to share that with him, and we were fully prepared. But none of that was necessary because of God's will. So I'm excited to see what God has planned for the Miller family and for Evie. because this is truly a miracle.
So to pause there again, amen. So, as Joe said, he said a couple really key things during that testimony. First of all, CPR cannot always save a life, but it is a really incredible tool that God can use if that's part of his will. On February 23rd, Joe is going to be here giving a free CPR class following the second service. And his goal is to get as many people certified as possible with this life-saving skill. So please prayerfully consider joining us for that, because we saw the power of that on this day. Another thing that you heard from Joe pretty clearly and unequivocally in my mind, I agree, that we experienced a miracle on that day. And I have one more example that I wanted to share with you. So we're on the ambulance and we're transporting the hospital. Joe's barefoot and he left his child at the party with a bunch of people he barely knows. And we're in an emergency. We're rushing to the hospital. And we stop and pull over and make a pit stop. Seemed a little odd at the time, but I was so tunnel visioned, I wasn't asking questions. Well, who did we stop to pick up? We stopped to pick up the chief paramedic of the area, who just so happened to be home and listening to his scanner when the call came in. This chief paramedic is in charge of making all of the schedules, so when the call came in and he heard which ambulance and which paramedic was picking it up, he knew the paramedic was new, he knew the statistics of the type of call that came in, and he knew the backup that might be needed. He was able to call and say, hey, I live less than half a mile away, en route to the hospital. Pull in and pick me up so that I can be back up. God orchestrated another mini miracle that day to put another person in place as an additional backup, just in case we should need him. I have so many more stories from that day that I could continue sharing. But what's even cooler is I can look back years in advance and see coordination and choreography on an even grander scale. This event happened 18 months on the heels of another Miller family miracle. On February 23rd, you're also going to hear from my husband, Justin, as he talks about the people, the events, the circumstances that God used to save his life in December of 2020, when he had a life-threatening brain tumor. God used December of 2020 to prepare us for this story that I'm telling you about today. If I take you another step backwards, let's go back to January of 2019. I am a small business owner, and anybody that owns a small business or has been around small business, two phrases: roller coaster and a lot of hats. You have these peaks of business success, and you have these valleys of redirecting, restructuring, and regrouping. You also wear a lot of hats, and for me, it was patient care, staff management, marketing, accounting, all of the things. And I loved it. But it was not always conducive to having a young family and work-life balance. So in January of 2019, I had a pretty steep and significant drop into a valley. And I had to work really hard to reposition, redirect, and regroup with my business when this valley hit. For 4 months, I worked really hard with my staff to redirect and kind of head a new direction. And by April, we were turning the corner and we were mid-pivot, and I get a phone call. And this phone call is out of left field. It's nothing I went looking for. It's nothing that was on my radar, nothing that I was really thinking about. And it's an offer I can't refuse. But in order to say yes to this phone call, I have to walk away from the last 4 months of the work and the last 9 years of incubating my business and my childhood dream of owning a medical practice. So within 7 weeks, we had closed the brick and mortar portion of my business, redirected again, had a completely different direction, got patients reestablished with another doctor, and I said goodbye to my amazing staff. Can you imagine the second guessing and the questions and the fear and the anxiety that was happening through this whole time? So we finally come up for a breather right after we had closed, and Justin and I were living in those condos right there, and we're sitting on our back patio, and we jokingly say, you know, Right now, we live here in Waterford, we have no family in the area, and we drive 2 different directions an hour each on our way to work. So when a call comes in and a kid has a headache or a stomach ache at school, at best, we can be there in an hour. And that's kind of hard, right? So we're jokingly sitting on our patio right after we closed, and we jokingly say, you know, now with this business change, it really makes more sense for us to be close to his work in Kenosha so that at least one of us is in the area for the kids. From the thought about moving to planning the move, executing the move, and moving day was just shy of 4 weeks. Not highly recommended on anybody's to-do list, especially on the heels of business changes and 2 young kids. So we moved to Kenosha. Then we have COVID, enough said. But the move to Kenosha opened a door. And when we moved to Kenosha, Sue and Brad, my amazing in-laws, were able to move up into the area to move 5 minutes from us so that they could be closer to their grandkids and they could be there to support us should we ever need them. That was November of 2020. 1 month later, almost to the day, I had to place that phone call. I had to rush Justin to the nearest level 1 trauma center, which happened to be Froedtert in Milwaukee, for a life-threatening brain tumor we knew nothing about. I needed somebody to be at my house right now to take care of my kids for an undefined amount of time while we figured this out. And they were 5 minutes away. Those 2 years, from January of 2019 through December of 2020, were, at best, let's use the word chaos. It was fear and anxiety and second guessing. It was walking by faith, many times not always by choice. But from the view of December of 2020, and again with this story that I've been sharing with you today, every twist and turn of those 2 years was exactly what we needed to put us where we needed to be with the people that needed to be there to help us get through these 2 major life events. So I'm hoping that somebody here maybe needs to hear that when your life feels derailed or God's sending you in a direction that you're not expecting, please remember our story and recognize that you probably just don't have the full story yet, that it's just a step in a much bigger picture than you can ever even imagine. So for me, I didn't put all of that together until Justin's event, and then again in Evie's near drowning. So let me take you back to the near drowning. We're on the ambulance, we've just picked up a new passenger, and we're headed to the hospital. We get to the hospital, meet the team, meet the doctor, and he sits down and talks to us about his faith and shares with us that he also believes wholeheartedly that we have experienced a miracle. We're transferred to Children's for 24-hour watch because there can be a lot of regression and complications. God held all of them at bay. And then we were released on a 3-week pneumonia watch, which thankfully also never happened. Before we got released from the hospital, we were counseled pretty heavily on PTSD. That events like this in children and or adults is a very high-risk scenario for PTSD. Evie was screened. They said they don't usually like to release the kids without psychological consult because of the risk. But because of post-COVID and medical health professionals being stretched too thin, they didn't have anybody there for us, and we were placed on a very long waiting list, somewhere between 9 and 18 months for counseling. So they told us, you need to seek counseling and you need to get it quickly because you need to delicately handle this situation to make sure that emotionally she can heal from this situation. So we get released from the hospital with this warning about delicately handling the situation, and school starts in 36 hours for the whole year. We have a lot of questions. Does Evie need another day of rest? Am I ready to walk down the hall and have hugs from all of these families that experience this with us and have questions thrown at me? Evie could remember every detail of the day, right down to the color of the towel she woke up on. And she would openly talk about it with us, which is great, but she's going to go to school and she's going to talk to her 8-year-old peers about everything she experienced. What is their reaction going to be like, and how is their reaction going to impact her? We have no idea how to handle this and what's the best situation for our child. God stepped in again. Sunday night, we were able to have a video call with a counselor that we were connected to from another family member. This counselor was technically still on vacation, but said, you know what? Yes, they need some help, they need some support, and so as a Christian brother, he met with us for a little over 2 hours. He prayed with us, he prayed over us, he answered our questions, he gave us guidance, and he's continued supporting us for the last 2.5 years. Under his guidance and his recommendations, Evie started school on that Monday right along with her peers and went into 3rd grade. 1 week later, on Labor Day of 2022, Evie jumped in a pool and she swam all afternoon with barely a hesitation. The following Monday, 2 weeks out from the event, her swim team starts back up for practices. She's voted captain of her swim team and had a fantastic swimming season in an event closely related to this traumatic event 2 weeks prior. God worked another mini miracle through her. She did not just survive this event, she thrived. And he gave her the tools, the fortitude, the strength, the people, the circumstances, everything that she needed and we needed to be able to thrive in that situation. Romans 8:28 says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, I can give a whole nother testimony on how I've started to see God using this story for his purpose. But in our own lives, it has deepened our own faith tremendously. It has opened us all up about our faith. We talk so much more openly, not just with our friends and our family and our community, but also in our own house about our faith and our struggles and our trials and our trust in God. It's taught us to walk by faith, sometimes by force, but when you do it by force and you experience it, you learn to do it. And it's turning all of our hearts towards service and charitable giving. So much so that in 17 days, we embark on another leap of faith as we go to Kenya with Changing a Destiny. I don't think that God's using this only for good in our lives. I pray and I started seeing how he's using it to build his kingdom and to bring hope, faith, and peace to other people through their own trials and tribulations. Today, I just pray that I've done this story justice and I've told it in a way that God wanted it to be told. I hope that you've seen the unequivocal miracle of August 26th, 2022, that you are sitting in awe of the sheer scale and magnitude of God's choreography and coordination. And I hope that you could feel God's supernatural presence today, in the last 2.5 years, and on that date, just over 2 years ago. I've been honored to be a part of and to kick off this series on signs and wonders, and I thank you guys for letting me share the story. Praise God.